4 years ago, I stood here together with you. You were physically present, and we discussed the unexpected result of the Trump election and the Brexit referendum. We were rather surprised because we had not seen, or many of us had not seen, that society changed over those years. It was at that time, and to some extent it is now, national versus international. Protectionism versus an openness towards the global economy and the global world. And it was the fear of the other that prompted so many in the United Kingdom to vote for leaving the European Union and to vote for Trump in the United States in 2016. What we realize now in 2020 with these presidential elections, that to some extent Trump was not an accident of history. Trump reflects, if we leave aside his rather unacceptable tweets, Trump represents some ideas that find the support of more than 70 million US voters. 72 million against somewhat 77 million for Joe Biden. And that demonstrates a tremendous division of the American society. There have always been differences between the Democrats and the Republicans. In my former life as Minister of Justice, I worked with ministers of justice, attorney generals of different political colors in the US, from the attorney generals under President Clinton to President Bush to President Obama. They were Democrats and Republicans. But on the fundamental issues, in particular also on international issues, they wanted to work with the European Union. They wanted to have alliances with Europeans on fighting terrorism. They wanted to have alliances within NATO on trying to stabilize the free world. And all that has changed during the past 4 years. In 2016, to some extent, we could have said, we Europeans, people didn't know what they were voting for by electing Donald Trump as President of the United States. This time, this was no longer true. We know that President Trump withdrew the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement. He withdrew the United States from the Iran nuclear agreement. He ordered that the United States would leave the World Health Organization and would leave the UNESCO, the United Nations Cultural Organization, and many other national moves that he did not coordinate with others. The division is therefore a quite substantial one, and one which should worry the rest of the world. These 72 million people, independent of who is President of the United States or who will be, as of January, President of the United States, will have to live with that fundamental change in the history of the United States. The other issues, the domestic issues, they will remain and they were always there. Take healthcare issues. You know, there was always between Democrats and Republicans a rather wide gap on those domestic issues. But they were not that fundamental that they split the whole society so fundamentally. And if you look back at the transitions from previous Democrat to Republican and Republican to Democrat presidencies, there was always a smooth transition, an harmonious transition which strengthened the American democracy. And that's probably to a large extent why quite a number of people, including myself, like the United States so much. It was democracy that worked at its best in the United States for a long time. It's the United States that, inspired many of us in building a free world. And to some extent, the fact that the United States is challenged by others economically, technologically, and politically probably led also to that reaction of the Trump voters as it led to the reaction of the Brexit voters in the United Kingdom. Look, in 1870, the United States took over as the world economic leader from Britain. Interestingly, Britain was leading the world. Then it became the United States. The United States in 1945 managed to defend the free world by liberating large parts of Europe. They built the post-world order by setting up the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions, IMF, World Bank. They helped establish NATO, and in fact are the true leader of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And they managed to become the world leading economic power. They represent 25% of world GDP. They are the largest military power in the world, and they have the most traded currency, the United States dollar. So what happens in the United States is of tremendous relevance to all of us. And the fact that there was this quite dramatic change under Trump, but as I said, it's not only Trump, it's also millions of voters who stand behind that, that has been put into question the last 4 years as a reaction probably to the fact that the competition to the United States became bigger in the world, but the reaction to that should not have been fear of the others, but trying to build new alliances, which the Trump administration did not want to do and failed to do. Now we are standing here in 2020, assuming that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will become the next leaders of the United States. And by the way, the fact that President Trump is challenging in so many states the result of democratic elections puts into question, and he wants to do that, the legitimacy of the American democracy. I think that's very worrisome. There can always be in one or the other state or in countries an irregularity in the voting system. That cannot happen on such a large scale in a country like the United States, where there are so many people of different political opinions present in these offices where the votes are being counted. So this is a clear populist attempt to destroy the institutions, to destroy the belief that the democracy functions, and that is another worrisome aspect of what is happening right now in the United States. But coming back to President-elect Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as the first woman that will become Vice President of the United States, they will face an opposition and a division in the United States that will not allow them to achieve a lot on domestic policies. It looks as if the Senate would again be controlled by the Republicans, whereas the House will be controlled by the Democrats, which in fact means that on many issues Joe Biden will not have the support of the Senate, although I temper that a little bit by the fact that he has been a senator for many, many years. He is known very well in reasonable democratic, in reasonable Republican segments of the Republican Party, and therefore I think that on some of these aspects he can get a bipartisan coalition to move forward on a certain agenda. But to understand what the Biden presidency will be, you know, in politics it's like in business and in life. It's a little bit a question where you come from and what your character is, and that you bring into your professional life, be it as a lawyer, be it as a citizen, be it as a business person, or be it as a politician. And therefore it's interesting to look back at the background of Joe Biden. Joe Biden is born during World War II in 1942. He's a lawyer, and by the way, interesting for us, both the president and the vice president, both are lawyers. Kamala Harris is a lawyer, former Attorney General of California. Joe Biden studied law at Syracuse University. He became a senator at the age of 30 in 1972. That was under President Nixon. So in a completely different world where, by the way, China did not play any role in world economic and political affairs yet. It was the time of the Cultural Revolution in China. China represented 1% of GDP. Today, it is almost equal in terms of economic power to the United States. Joe Biden grew up both as a person after the war and also as a politician, because he then served for 36 years as senator from Delaware in the United States Senate. He grew up in a world where the international organizations, such as the UN, NATO, the World Bank, and IMF, which I mentioned beforehand, were the guiding principles of the free world. Russia was behind the Iron Curtain. The Chinese, as I said, were not yet playing any major role. And so America could really become the leaders of the world. And so the America First was there quite naturally. Whereas today, America First is challenged, and Trump led thereby to something which he called America First, which is America alone, whereas I believe that Joe Biden believes also in America First. It's a traditional American leadership role, but he does not want to do it alone, because he has always been, including during the years where he served as Vice President of the United States from 2009 to 2016, he was clearly somebody who knows world leaders, who likes to work with world leaders, and who has a clear vision of the free world, which means democracy, rule of law, which means agreements with other countries and the respect of those agreements also thereafter. Quite the opposite of what Donald Trump did. So Joe Biden, by his background, by his history, by the way he acted, he knows all those world leaders, including those that are still there today from his time as vice president. He interacted with President Putin. He interacted with Angela Merkel, with President Xi. He went several times to China. And you should not forget that while he was in the Senate, he chaired two interesting committees. One was the Foreign Relations Committee, which is a very powerful committee of the Senate. So there he got quite a good view of what is happening in the world. And he chaired also the Senate Judiciary Committee, which of course for us as lawyers also shows that he has quite respect for the institutions, the judicial institutions of the United States. He was present at some of these very challenging hearings for appointing new judges, justices to the US Supreme Court, and other events where he played a key role. So he knows the institutions, he respects the institutions, he knows the world, and he respects allies. Kamala Harris is also quite interesting in this context. She is probably the first one after the first vice president that comes from a completely different background and represents an America that is less turned towards Europe, but more towards Asia and Latin America, which is a large community in the United States today, which was not the case when Joe Biden started his political career. She's Asian, she's half Latin American, Jamaica's mother from India, but she has an excellent background in education. As I said, she's also a lawyer, and she will, of course, represent a large segment of the community that, with the exception of Barack Obama, felt probably that they were less represented with their concerns in Washington. This being said, if you look at her statements, she is less from the center than Joe Biden. Joe Biden, because of his position, his age, his positions in the past, will be leaned more towards Europe and more to the center, whereas she represents a new America that is much further away from the conservative America in the middle of the United States that voted for Donald Trump. The combination of Biden and Harris was, of course, an excellent in terms of political strategy. It will be challenging for her to move into the center if she wants to become the president after the term of Joe Biden, because Joe Biden said, and that's also quite interesting, he will only do one term in the presidency. As I said, both will be blocked in some of their domestic ambitions by a Senate that is Republican dominated, or probably will be Republican dominated, because the elections in some states will only be decided in beginning of January. But assuming that it will be the case, then Joe Biden will, in my view, to a large extent focus on international relations. That's what he knows best, that's where I think he will succeed best, whereas domestically he will try to unite without probably achieving great changes. Internationally, he can build again an America that we, certainly my generation, knows best, which is an America that is a friend, an ally, and a leader of the free world. What does that mean for some of the international topics that they are facing? Let me go through a number of them. Europe, trade, defense, China, Russia, Middle East. Just briefly, but to give you a picture of what I think this presidency will mean. On Europe, you saw the number of people who congratulated him, of European leaders who congratulated Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as of the first evening, a few days after the elections, when the result was more or less clear. They all believe that a new transatlantic relationship will start. And I think that there will be a honeymoon between the US and the EU for the next 2 years to come. However, the number of issues where we will have common views might not be that big. Of course, the first one, and I think a quite important one, will be climate change. I think we will reunite, and that is very positive, on the challenges of climate change. Joe Biden has announced that he will immediately return to the Paris Agreement, and I think that's one of the biggest transformations of our societies in the next 2 decades for the world. So that's a very positive aspect. I think we will unite more on security issues, and I will come back to that in the context of NATO, but the fight against terrorism, the coordination of our forces to fight the fundamentalism, to fight the destabilizing effects of failed states. I think there, indeed, the United States and the European Union will cooperate again a lot. Because one fundamental difference between Biden and Trump is that Biden likes the European Union, as most of his predecessors did. I had the pleasure and honor to attend 2 meetings in the White House under President Bush. And you could say that was not an easy time, because remember that was after the Iraq war. But yet Bush, his predecessor Clinton, and afterwards Obama, they always supported a common European view. It was considered to be in the interest of the United States to have a strong ally, which is the European Union. Trump, on the contrary, like Johnson in the United Kingdom, for them, they felt that they were stronger by doing things alone, which in fact did not happen. They were weaker being alone, which helped, by the way, during the Trump presidency, which helped China to get stronger, which helped Russia and others also to come out of their position, which was a position more of weakness beforehand, because the Americans and Europeans dominated the political agenda. When America left, when America withdrew under Trump, President Xi and China could become much stronger. So on European issues such as climate change and the fight against terrorism, we will cooperate. Now it will be much more difficult on other issues. And that is not the fault of America, but that is the problem of the European Union. The European Union does not have a common foreign policy. We disagree on the attitude of the European Union vis-à-vis China. Some believe we should work with China on, for instance, technological progress, such as 5G. Others believe we should not. We are divided in Europe on our attitude towards Russia. the Eastern Europeans are much more reluctant towards cooperation with Russia than the Western Europeans, including Luxembourg. Libya, within the European Union, some are supporting the government that is recognized by the United Nations, I think the majority, whereas France, for instance, is supporting the coalition led by General Haftar. I give you only those three examples, Russia, China, Libya, where the Europeans have no common voice. I think the fact that we now have, with President Biden, somebody who likes the European Union, should force us, if we want to play a role in the world, to unite, to make compromises, to have a common European view, combined with a common American view that would make us much stronger in world affairs. Trade is another interesting issue. Trade is extremely important for world affairs. We know that the policy of President Trump was to raise tariffs to start trade wars, which on the short term might have protected jobs in the United States. And indeed, the growth rate of the US during the past few years was not that bad. But I think in the long term, he damaged quite a lot. Where do I see President Biden there, also based on what he did when he was vice president? I think that Biden really is not a person that will start trade wars. On the other hand, I do not think that he will immediately enter into free trade agreements, because historically, the Republicans were the free traders. And I was so many times in the US, I met so many senators and Congress people from the Republicans. They very often started, when we discussed trade issues, by saying, we are free traders. Historically, the liberals, the Democrats, Joe Biden's party, they were not on the side of free trade. I think, though, that after what happened under President Trump, he will first try to strengthen the US economy, and then he will slowly but surely enter again into a number of free trade agreements. I think that will take at least 2 to 3 years before the American economy will have recovered also from the current pandemic. Let us not forget that the US economy also is suffering right now quite substantially. The number of unemployed people increased dramatically in the United States. So Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will be faced with a dramatic economic situation. And as long as that has to be stabilized, he will not enter into free trade agreements. The US is also confronted in the area of trade of tremendous trade deficits. The US have a trade deficit with Europe of almost 170 billion, and with the US of more than $300 billion. And that, of course, requires the president to some extent, strengthen his economy before he can open the doors. But I expect him to withdraw some of the tariffs after a certain period of time that have been introduced, because it will help him also to achieve political goals by stopping the trade wars that his predecessor started. So trade will be an interesting issue to observe. In short, no trade wars anymore, no strong statements against other trading partners, but I do not expect free trade agreements at the beginning of his term in office. Defense, another interesting issue between Europe and the United States. As I said, he was born and he grew in politics in a time after 1945, and I would say also after the end of the Cold War, which was dominated by the leadership of the United States. And he knows and he believes, and he said that in many statements over the past 10 years, that he believes in the strengths of NATO, which, by the way, to a large extent, is an American-led organization. I served for 2 years as Minister of Defense, and you could feel when you went to these NATO meetings that America is, by the way, one of the only armies, or maybe the only army, in NATO that can quickly intervene around the world. You have also the British and the French, but all the others are very difficult to be deployed, certainly on a short term. And the NATO was always an instrument for the Americans to influence beyond military issues the security and political agenda of the Western world. I think Biden will reinforce that. That means, however, not that he will not require any more Europeans to spend more on defense. It is a mistake to believe that only Trump said that Europeans should spend 2% of their GDP on defense. Luxembourg, by the way, to give you an idea, spends 0.6% of its GDP on defense. Others do around 1%, very few have 2%. Obama, Bush, they all asked the Europeans to do more. And I believe that while Biden may not say it in the same manner than Trump said it, he will nevertheless also ask the Europeans to do more. Also because the Americans will have to look more towards Asia. And what I mentioned before with regard to Kamala Harris will reinforce that, so they will look more towards Asia. And their presence in Europe after World War II, which has been discussed many times since World War II, will continue to be a question of disagreement between the Europeans and the Americans. But on defense, I think he will be more a partner than a problematic, was not even a partner, problematic at times using terms like enemy by Donald Trump, but he will not change fundamentally on the objective that Europeans have to do more for their own security. I think that he will not enter any war in general, because his son served in Iraq, which was a very difficult moment, like for any parent whose children have to go to war. But he opposed the Iraq war strongly at the time. He softened his stance a little bit afterwards, but he certainly is not somebody who will send easily American troops abroad. I think what he will do, as they did when Obama was president, also to some extent after the Iraq war under Bush, they will use much more their special forces, which are extremely efficient. They will use diplomacy and intelligence to intervene there where their interests are at stake. So that is positive for the rest of the world, that we do not have to discuss, hopefully, unless major events happen, the intervention by the United States, our allies, and also within NATO, where they would have to intervene. On two other issues, I think we will have differences with the United States. China is one of those. What is very interesting to see, and I saw that during the last few years during visits both in Beijing and in Washington, that Democrats and Republicans alike feel that the biggest long-term challenge and threat to the United States is the growing power of China. That started with economic factors, and I think it became the most apparent with the technological advances of China. China has, over a period of 20, 30 years, been able to develop its own technology with brilliant engineers, by the way, many of them trained in the United States. And once they realized that, the Americans thought, what can we do here? What is the right attitude to stop that threat of domination by China of the world? That is the common answer of Democrats and of Republicans there is that we have to stop the Chinese ambitions. And that's why they will force, as they started already doing, the Europeans to choose between China and America. And 5G Huawei is a very good example of that. I think we Europeans should not let us have to choose between China and the United States. Obviously, in terms of values, in terms of freedom, we are much closer to the United States, and that's why we often say, not only after World War II, we share common values. I think that remains true. The soft power of America is tremendous. The music, the clothes, the fashion, the art. And yet, I think in a world that has fundamentally changed, it is of importance for Europe also to build bridges and have strong links with China. But in that balance, that will be very difficult to come to a common agreement with China, with the United States on China, sorry. The fact that China is considered a threat, by the way, is not new. In 2005, when Luxembourg had the presidency of the European Union, I went to Washington at a difficult time as Minister of Defense, and one of the first meetings I had at the Pentagon was, I didn't ask for this, but they forced me to do that, to have a briefing in one of these dark basements of the Pentagon on China. That is 15 years ago, and you see that they then realized that China was spending a lot of money on their military and on technology, and nobody believed then, however, that 20 years afterwards they would already have achieved, both economically, technologically, and on a military point of view, the role that they have achieved today. So what I want to say by that is a constant of American policy, and that will, in my view, continue under President Biden. Which does not mean that we cannot talk with America about that, but we would ideally have a tripartite world where China, Europe, and the US can, at least on some issues, such as climate change, such as some security issues, move ahead together. Internet and who controls Internet, what are the rules about Internet, all the issues of IP and subsidies to state-owned companies in China will also be a difficult issue to handle by President Biden, and I think he will be very strong against China on those issues. Whereas we have a little bit forgotten that we also should take part in the debate about the future of the internet and everything that is related to the new disruptive technologies. As we are not united, we lose our leadership in those areas. The United States had it, they are still working on that, China is acquiring it, and we observe, which is the wrong attitude. On Russia, very briefly, I think that on Russia, he is, as I said, that's always why you have to look at the curriculum vitae of somebody. I think there he has a rather old-fashioned view. Russia has to pay the price for the violation of international law. That's his position for a number of years. So he will be tough on Russia with reference to Crimea, with reference to Ukraine, with reference to some intervention in other parts of the world, because Russia, like China, used the absence of the Americans from international negotiating tables to strengthen their role a little bit in world affairs during the past few years. They appeared in some theaters of operations where Russians were absent beforehand. And so I think on China he will be tough, on Russia he will be tough in the old-fashioned style. In the Middle East, I think nothing will substantially change, because Democrats and Republicans in the United States have always been a very strong supporter of everything that Israel is doing. Trump achieved, probably thanks to his son-in-law Jared Kushner, a number of achievements in the Middle East, but at the same time he angered large parts of the Palestinians, and thereby also of some Europeans, in what he decided with regard to Jerusalem. So I think that Biden will be a strong supporter of Israel, but there will not be a lot of changes in that policy. By the way, it's quite interesting if you read the tweet by Prime Minister Netanyahu after the election of Biden. People thought Netanyahu is very close to Trump, but he immediately said, Joe, we know each other for a very long time, and I look forward to working with you together for security of our region. So Biden, by his long-term service in the Senate, knows the Israelis, he knows the Jewish community, which is very strong in the United States, and with all those elements, I think we do not expect major changes of policy in the Middle East. The biggest change probably will be, and that is extremely needed, will not be so much on substance, but will be more on tone. And in politics, like in life, values, the form, the tone, the character matters a lot. He's a man, and if you read his statements, if you observe him also in the past when he served as vice president, he will replace hostility by mutual respect. He will be open to listen to others. He will travel the world and try to forge alliances. And after a period like we had observed under President Trump, I think that will be extremely positive, that we can put feet on earth, that we can sit around the table, and that we can discuss things. For Europe, it's a unique chance, provided we unite on certain issues, that we have again a partner. NATO will be reinforced. He will come back probably to the World Health Organization. He will respect the functioning of the United Nations organizations and probably also pay again into the budget, because we have to know that most of these United Nations organizations, the biggest contributor is the United States. So without the United States, nothing is possible in the United Nations and on other bigger issues. Without the United States, I think achieving substantial progress on climate change and in the fight against terrorism is not possible. But the United States cannot do it alone. So we have to do it with the United States. And we Europeans have to realize that. That does not mean that maybe like after the World War II, the United States could dominate the world. They will, to some extent, lead again, and hopefully they will lead the free world. But in a world that has changed fundamentally, where Asia and China play a much bigger role, we need to partner with the United States on an equal level. We have to look into their eyes and take that hand of partnership that he will for sure show to the Europeans. So we'll see more alliances, we will see more partnerships, we will see more cooperation, we will see more dialogue. The content will be difficult, as I said, because the American population has changed, because this huge gap, which I mentioned before, and which is broader than ever before on fundamental issues. So this gap also between cities and rural communities has to be bridged. If he manages that a little bit at home, if at the same time he can rebuild alliances around the world, then I think we can be rather optimistic for the next 5 years. We have enough challenges out there, security, climate, fundamentalism, that if we try to do that alone, then we will fail. If we try to do it together, and if we try to unite a little bit, and that's not only the role of the President of the United States, that's also the role of all leaders, but also of all citizens, to approach people with some respect, to respect the rule of law, the freedom of men, the freedom of expression. I think if we can all contribute a little bit to that, also in the way we communicate, I think then I'm rather optimistic about the next 4 years if the transition to the Biden presidency will, what I hope, be harmonious in January 2021. So that is what I wanted to share with you. I would by far prefer, of course, now to discuss those issues with you, because all of you have observed this during the past few weeks and months. But we have, of course, the chance today, which we didn't have 4 years ago, that since the last elections, we opened our office in New York, and of course our friends, our team of Elvinger in New York are of course on the ground, and they observe that from a different perspective than the European perspective, and in particular, and I think that is relevant for us also in our daily practice in the law firm, what the business community, the New York business community, is thinking about a presidency of the Democrats. Republicans were often considered to be business-friendly as the Democrats, but Trump, of course, could not be put in any category there. And therefore, we have invited our friend Nicolas Fermaud in New York to give us a brief overview on what the US, the New York business community, the legal community in New York is thinking these days since Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were elected as President and Vice President of the United States. So Nicolas, so thanks first of all to all of you who have listened in, and Nicolas, if you can hear me, I can see you on the screen. If you can hear me, then I would pass you the floor to give us this overview from New York. Please.
Thank you very much, Luc. First of all, allow me to also extend a warm welcome to everybody who is listening in. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. And thank you to Luc, to you, and to everybody who's organized this to invite me to contribute and to share the perspective and the underground impressions here of the New York and US business community. And interestingly enough, those impressions and those feelings actually overlap to a very large extent with what you just said. But maybe before going into that, I wanted to offer a little bit of context about the election that we just had in the US, because that may be something that is being less reported on in the European press. So in terms of context, what everybody needs to see and understand is that despite the fraud claims coming from the Trump campaign, the last election have been a huge democratic success. They have seen a participation, I think you mentioned 72 or 75 million voters for one candidate and 75 or 77 for the other candidate, so participation around 150 million persons. It's in absolute terms, it's huge. It's the largest participation in absolute terms in the last years, obviously, but also in terms of percentage, because the country grows, so you could have imagined that in absolute terms the number grows, but in terms of percentage it stays the same. But absolutely not. We had a participation here of about 60, just a little under 67% of the voting population, and that compares, to give a benchmark, that compares to 58% on Obama's second term. So it is a huge increase, and it means that A, it's a hugely successful democratic exercise, but also B, that each of the candidates has drawn huge support from their electorate and beyond their traditional electorate. And what it really gives is, it's an impression, or it's a picture of a very starkly divided country, basically, or roughly, the two coasts and then the middle of the country, which have very different views and which are more polarized than they've ever been. Maybe also in terms of context, on Trump himself and his presidency, it's clear that he will go down in history books as a form of president of chaos, the diplomacy of tweets, things that had not been done in the past. But if you look at his administration, the type of program that they've developed over the last 4 years, you'll notice that it's actually a fairly standard Republican platform that they've run. It's deregulation of various sectors, including internet, including nursing homes. It's increase of the military spending. It's decrease of immigration. It's decrease of environmental protection. And it's an increase of so-called Republican judges. So the Republicans this time, or this administration, was able to appoint a very large number of judges, both at federal level and obviously at Supreme Court, as you will have seen in the press. So overall, for a number of voters for the Trump presidency, it's for a number of them, it's his style. But for a large chunk of his electorate, it's actually just regular conservatives who have been quite happy and think that he has actually achieved a number of successes in the last 4 years in terms of a traditional Republican agenda. So having put those things into perspective, what does the New York and wider US business community hope from a Biden presidency? Well, I think there are again two things that come up in every discussion I have. First, it's that the Senate is going, or is likely to remain Republican. What it means is that, as Luc, you've mentioned, Republicans are traditionally seen as more business-friendly. Democrats are seen as more engaged towards social aspects of society. And so from the business community's perspective, a change at the helm of the state was, for the majority of them, desirable. But on the other hand, ensuring that the Senate remains Republican is actually a fairly happy outcome, in that the more liberal aspects, and inclinations of the Democratic Party, of the Democrats, will not be followed under a Biden presidency, because they will be blocked, or they are very likely to be blocked by the Senate. So from the business community's perspective, it's actually an excellent outcome, a change at the helm of the state, but policy-wise, no expectation that things will change. The second aspect that always comes up during discussions with our friends and business partners here in the US is that it's a reminder. It's a reminder in that we, as business community, are very fortunate that we can also vote based on moral criteria, based on things that are, in the longer term, important for us and for mankind in general. Climate change, a stable diplomatic policy, etc. I'm being reminded that for a number of persons in this country, an actually large number of persons in this country, they vote as they live from paycheck to paycheck. So it's really what these voters have seen is that under a Trump presidency, the economy has fared extremely well, and unemployment has been at the lowest for everybody, including minorities, since the establishment of statistics. So for a number of Trump supporters, the economic aspect was actually the most important, and we are fortunate that we can look past some of the more day-to-day aspects of life and embrace goals such as reducing climate change, etc. So with those things, with the presidency having been put into context, and also with those considerations that always come up in discussions with business partners here and colleagues from the US business community, what is the role that they really see for Joe Biden and for his administration? Generally speaking, it's always one of a healer in the sense that America is starkly divided, as I mentioned from the outset, and the intention here, or the hope, is that Joe Biden will be able to bring America together again, so to say. That Joe Biden will not necessarily change much in terms of policies or politics, except obviously for climate change, except also for immigration, but from an economic perspective, not change much what was done in the past, but that his style, his tone, will be able to appease the divisions of the country, and that he will be able to heal or bring back those two divided Americas together. Voila, Luc, those were the impressions I wanted to share with you. Maybe back to you and to questions from the audience if there are any.
I think if you hear me, I took the liberty to be in live with Luc. And I have a question which actually concerns, you told us a lot for the 4 years to come, but I have a question which concerns the after the 4 years. You said that Biden was probably, and the question is to both of you actually, Biden is looked at as a possible healer of bringing this America back again, but I think that if you want to bring two people back again, you need to be two. And what I don't see is on the Republican side, is there anyone who will be able to replace Trump, or will we be back with Trump in 2024?
So Pete, that's actually an excellent question. And it's interesting because on this side of the Atlantic, it's one that comes up in the newspaper almost on a daily basis. And the thought here is that if Trump concedes now, he may indeed want to run again in 4 years, and he's taking practical steps to be able to do so. So the last one that he took was that he established a political action committee, which is a form of vehicle here to be able to raise funds and to deploy those funds towards initiatives within the Republican Party that will benefit or favor his candidacy in 2024. So it's a form for him to keep his grip on the Republican Party. Now, the reality is the country as of today and the country in 4 years may be very different and may look very different. So the changes that the Biden and Harris administration will do to the society may be profound. In 4 years' time, Trump himself may be barred because of age. So we actually don't know whether being, I think, 78 or 79 in 4 years' time, whether he'll still be able to appeal to his electorate. Will he be again put into bankruptcy because a number of his loans are becoming due in 2 or 3 years? So it's very difficult to predict nowadays whether he himself will be able to run, whether if he's able to run, whether he will still have the momentum that he has today with his electorate. And then obviously on the Democrat side, whether Kamala Harris will be in a position to run herself for president, because that's the stated intention on the Democrat side. That will obviously depend on how she fares with Joe Biden, in the next 4 years. But it may indeed be that in 4 years' time, the US are ready for a woman as a president. Yes. Yeah. Luc, I don't know if you see things differently.
I think that to some extent, the attitude of Trump in the next 2 to 3 weeks will play also a major role in this. I think this is a major crisis that he creates by challenging in so many states the outcome of these elections. And so I think this is a fundamental turning point possibly for the functioning of the US democracy, and the reaction of the voters on both sides, of the moderate people in both parties to what is happening now, might have a huge influence also on what's happening thereafter. Personally, I do not think that Trump will come back, but the question therefore for me is more, or not more, but to a large extent also on the Democratic side, for the reasons I said, not those that you mentioned with regard to Kamala Harris. I think gender will not play such a role, but the question will be whether she, who is a more modern, more on the what we would call à la gauche of the political spectrum of the Democratic Party, coming from California, which has always been more liberal, whether she can also get the support of the moderate Republicans and of the Democrats, because she's a completely different type and background than Joe Biden. It's a new America, as I called it beforehand. in terms of geographical background, in terms of vision of America. And so I think the Democrats, when they do it well now, when they can heal, if they can heal, and if she can project her views to a broader public, then I think the Democrats can win. I think Trump, even within the Republican Party, will face to some extent opposition. People agreed with some of his policies, and you mentioned, Nicolas, some of his successes. But I think quite a number of Republicans also disagreed with his style. And again, I agree with you, in 4 years, it's a long time from now. But so I look forward to seeing all of you in 2024, because we did this in 2016, Brexit, Trump. Brexit is, by the way, not yet finished. They left, but with all the challenges that a policy of doing it alone means. So we see that in the UK, we see it now in the US, and therefore it will be very interesting to do this exercise again in 2024. So thanks a lot to everybody. It was great sharing these views with you, and I look forward to getting your feedback when we meet in smaller groups in the coming days and weeks in our office here. So I wish you a nice weekend, all the best, and see you soon. Thank you, bye-bye.